Israel-Palestine conflict has a long history, and there still seems to be no clear solution. A major event was the Independence War and the creation of an Israeli state in 1948. This event set in motion several conflicts, including the 1948 Independence War, the 1967 Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the oil crisis, the First Intifada, and in 2000, the Second Intifada. Nowadays, there is still a lot of tension in the area, with occasional violent outbursts. In March 2015, Benjamin Netanyahu was re-elected as Prime Minister of Israel. He is a member of the right-wing Likud party, and his foreign policy towards the Palestinian areas is often considered as exclusionary and discriminatory by Europeans. This documentary will show how some Israelis disagree with Netanyahu's foreign policy regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict. We've interviewed several young Israelis about their oppositional views, and together with academics in the field of conflict studies, religion and history, we will show you their stories. In April 2015, we went to Israel and the Palestinian areas to speak with 5 youngsters. They grew up during the Second Intifada and developed an oppositional attitude towards Netanyahu's policy regarding Palestine. We wanted to know more about this generation. How does it feel to have an oppositional opinion in Israel? How do they experience the conflict and its history? How do they think it affects their identity? And how do they express themselves in this situation? We started our journey with an interview throughout the region and tries to bridge the differences of their members by engaging them in dialogue. They emphasize that they all want the same thing, a peaceful, quiet and safe region to live in. We've asked our interviewees how they experience the Israeli history. Hamza is born in Palestine. He is 25 years old. He went to university in Ramallah and is currently working for Yalla. Ofri is born in Israel. She's 26 years old. She did obligatory military service after high school, but now works with Hamza within Yalla.
History has a lot of impact on Israeli culture. I think it kind of shaped us, and it's used in the education system to shape us, starting from the Holocaust, which is a very big thing, to the 1948 war and 67 war and Yom Kippur War, and you learn a lot about in high school about both the Holocaust and kind of the aliyot, the waves that came to Israel before 48, and of course the War of Independence. And it's all taught from a very, no one's gonna like me for saying this, but we were, it's taught in a way that makes you feel entitled to this land because you deserved it, because you were harmed, because you were chased out of somewhere, because, you were slaughtered in gas chambers, and which all very true, but it creates this sense of entitlement. A lot of Israelis wouldn't talk about the Nakba. I would.
What's the
Nakba? I'm gonna give it to you.
It's Arabic word, means catastrophe, which it refers to the loss of this land when Palestinians left and became refugees either in West Bank and Gaza or around the world. So we call that day, which is the Independence Day for Israel, we call it Nakba, the catastrophe.
Yeah, so it's very, it's illegal to talk about the Nakba in schools, if I'm not mistaken. Even Arab schools can't teach it. And if you look at a lot of Arab villages, they have a lot of family in the West Bank, or a lot of family that are refugees. So it's very, it's very tricky. History is seen in very different ways between the Israelis and Palestinians, and one of the things that I personally believe can change, how we see each other is if we start learning about kind of how we both see the historical events.
But the most recent history is basically the Holocaust.
Samantha is born in America and raised with Zionist views. She's 30 years old. She came to Israel 8 years ago and now has Israeli citizenship.
The Holocaust is used to justify everything that happens in this country. Everyone hates the Jews, anti-Semitism. This is, I think, in my opinion, this is a propaganda that's used a lot to justify the things we do, and I don't think it's correct. But I think that a lot of our culture is based on history. It's not based on the present day. I think that it actually keeps us from being able to be progressive because we're too stuck in the past.
Also what you're taught here in school.
Lee is born and raised in Jerusalem and is from a half Israeli, half American family. She's 24 years old and finished her degree in literature and sociology and now works as a manager at a backpackers hostel.
And all of your upbringing is this combination of Jewish culture and Israeli history and Zionist history and European Jewish history. You have a very strong sense of your heritage here.
I think that people should realize that the past is not something to dwell on, that you have to realize right now that this is the country we're living in, these are the circumstances we have. It doesn't really matter what happened to us, 60 years ago. This is the time to focus on. And I think this is a really big problem in Israel, which is also why things can't really move forward, is because people are so stuck in the past. And it's not just Israeli Jews, it's also the Israeli Arabs. They're also a little bit held back of remembering resentments and things like that. And I think that history is something that is only plagued with this whole situation and needs to be forgotten.
Every family almost in Israel has lost someone in a war, in a terrorist attack, in guarding, and somehow because of this conflict. And for a lot of people it makes it really hard. It makes it really, hard to trust.
Jewish history definitely affected the current policies towards the conflict, because it's funny, the rest of the world looks at the situation and sees the Palestinians as the victims, but Israelis really believe we are the victims because we're so used to being the victims, because the history of the Jewish people is being chased out of everywhere we've gone to. My grandmother had a Spanish surname, but she was from Poland, and that has roots in the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And then she moved to Israel and her entire family was killed in Europe in the Holocaust. And long before that, that was the history of the Jewish people.
Lee talks about victimhood, which can be related to collective trauma. Lucien van Lier focuses on the role of religion in the context of violent conflict. He will explain to us what collective trauma is and how it is shaped.
Something categorical if I am persecuted because I'm a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim, because of my religious identity, or I have an ethnic identity, or I have all kind of other possible identities, because I fit within a category that is victimized in a certain sense, that is object of persecution, that is fit for persecution from the perspective of the perpetrator, then the atrocity sticks to my identity. I am persecuted because I'm a Muslim, because I'm a Christian, to put it at a religious level. And this Muslim identity, this Jewish identity or Christian identity or ethnic identity becomes more important because I am persecuted. So this persecution becomes part of who I am. Now, you have two sides that you can go, and both sides are in the interviews, are present. One side is the real Holocaust, that is a real atrocity, that is a real collective violence, that resulted in a real collective trauma. That's one. And that real collective trauma created discourses as they don't want us, they don't understand us. we are special in our suffering, yeah, in a certain way. And the other level is the political level, and all the people are referring also to the political level. The political level, there is the trauma, not a real trauma, but it has much more become a chosen trauma. Yeah? A chosen trauma is something that is based on a real trauma, but it uses a certain discourse in order to get a specific political program through the decision making. Yeah. A chosen trauma is a trauma that is used as a collective signifier, as a part of a collective identity.
And really, I think more sort of mainstream Israelis, that's not too arrogant to say, will pull it out just like whenever they're having an argument with anybody who says anything against Israel, that like, never again can this happen to us. And of course, never again should it happen to us, but I always think there are so many other ways we could have addressed the memory of the Holocaust, like protecting other people around the world who are going through difficult things, and instead we just use it as a tool to protect ourselves.
I think that it's a bit of a misunderstanding if the world views the Jews' experience of the Holocaust.
Noam is born in a settlement outside Jerusalem. He's 29 years old. Noam studies philosophy and social works and also works in a hostel. His father is a member of the Likud party.
Their traumatic collective memory as a means to an end, because I think it had an impact, and I think it shaped this country, and it shaped the conflict, and it's shaping what's happening here to this day, more so than a lot of experiences which on the surface are more relevant. So I think it's not as much as bringing it in or using it as accepting it. And I only wish that more Israelis would be better at explaining this. Because the memory of the Holocaust has its place in this discussion. It should have its place. It's not a justification for behavior. It shouldn't be, but it could be an explanation to a lot of the mindset here and a lot of the reasoning of why we want to have a Jewish country. Because otherwise, it really it doesn't make sense.
I think the education of this country needs to change. I think actually the biggest threat of this country is not necessarily traumatic events, but the education that people get when they're children. The fact that the schools are usually separated between Arabs and Jews. The fact that Jews never are expected to learn Arabic. Like some will, but it's very rare. And Arabs are expected to speak Hebrew. So I think it's more education in this country than traumatic events. I think traumatic events are used as a form of propaganda, but it's not necessarily meaning that it's happening to every single person, you know?
Even though I didn't experience it, it's still very much a part of who you are. Because you've heard the stories and you don't have family and you're Hungarian but you're not Hungarian. You have a passport citizenship but you're not really living there. I have family there. It's a very kind of mix in how it influenced us as a population, but it's important to remember, and I think it needs to be considered as a memory and not as a necessarily trauma.
And there is this structural level of trauma, and that which results into something like a chosen trauma, where trauma is used at a political level. And the problem is, in the interviews, there is a certain tension between both traumas. On the one hand, there is this acknowledgement of trauma as a real trauma. We suffered, really, and suffering is part of our identity and our history. And sometimes it is even so strong that we do not accept ourselves also as perpetrators in a violent atrocity, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And on the other hand, there is also distrust towards the politicians who are using the Holocaust in a certain way.
In 2009, Benjamin Netanyahu was elected as Prime Minister of Israel, and his Likud party came to power. He was re-elected in March 2015. some Israelis found the outcome of the election shocking and had hoped for a different outcome. Peter Malcontent is an expert on the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. He will tell us more about the origins of the Likud party.
Well, even though the Likud party does not exist that long, it was only established in the 1970s, it has a pretty long history. Actually, it includes those Zionists with a rather radical view on the existence of the Jewish state. And here it becomes complicated, and that is that to a certain extent what is a difference with earlier times is that in the beginning, in the 20s and 30s, the radical Zionists were not in fact religious people. You had religious Jews, and you had the Zionists. The Zionists were not religious. Most of them were quite leftist or had a leftist past in which religion was not that important. But at a certain moment of time, Zionist politicians started to realize that they could integrate a religious element in the legitimation of occupying and keeping occupied the occupied territories of Gaza. And nowadays they are in a situation in which they can't govern the country with a majority government without support of those radical religious Jews.
Netanyahu believes that he represents the Jews, so he doesn't represent me, and doesn't represent probably also the other Israelis who are not Jews.
He said he does.
He does. In this context, he chose not to represent a lot of different groups in this band.
I describe Netanyahu generally as a spineless worm. I don't think he's really had much of a policy over the last few years. I think he's had a policy of remaining in power no matter what the price. But he's let a lot of things sort of happen behind the scenes in the meantime that are very discriminatory to the Palestinians. So a little expansion of a settlement here, and let the soldiers a little bit do whatever they want there. So, you know, stop people at the checkpoints and give them a harder time in the morning. And if a soldier kills a Palestinian in a demonstration in the West Bank, then let's turn a blind eye. But I think in the last elections there was a very big turn in the way he speaks. I think he sort of came out of his right-wing closet because on election day, I'm sure you guys heard, he came out with this statement that the Arabs are running to the voting booths and all the right-wing people have to go and vote and save us. And I can't believe that a prime minister who's supposed to represent those people too said such a racist thing, and he wouldn't take it back. He apologized 6 days later because he had so much pressure from the international community.
For me, because of the subculture I belong in, I saw this as a great opportunity to finally get rid of Netanyahu. I'm sick of him. I do not want him back in office. I didn't want him to be back in office, and I thought that a lot of the Israelis, that they would agree with me. It turns out I live in a bubble, and not everyone agreed with me, and there was another party that was really showing a lot of hope, which was the Zionist Union, and they lost to Likud, to Netanyahu's party.
The role the media plays nowadays is intertwined with conflict. Frames are being made and stories are changed.
Let me put it in this way. The way in which Western media write and talk about conflict has become much more moderate than it actually was a couple of decades ago. Because a couple of decades ago, especially until the start of the 1970s, it was all pro-Israel, you know, without any doubt. Things started to change a little bit when economic interest for the West started to come into the picture. So after the war of 1973, an international oil crisis erupted, and this costed money to the West because the West was dependent on Arab oil. So then a kind of different view started to develop. And nowadays you could say that it depends a little bit on in which Western country you live, how the media are talking about the conflict.
First of all, I think that the media has no idea what's going on here. Most of the media, I feel like, especially from Europe, is people that have never lived in this country and do not understand the situation of what's happening here. First of all, I'll just give you like a small example. Like obviously, like things happen here that are horrible, but the fact that photos would be confused with what was happening in Syria and say that's what's happening in Jerusalem or on the West Bank and this kind of stuff, and it's completely inaccurate. I think that it's fueling this miseducation of what is happening in this country. I think the only way for people to really understand what's happening in this country is for them to come here. The media, every media outlet is going to have a different way of portraying the story, but every single one of them is inaccurate. There is no one that I think has ever been like, I've never read an article and been like, oh yeah, they get it. It doesn't happen. I think that the media focuses on something and doesn't actually shed light on the entire country. It's so focused on the conflict that they don't realize there are good things about it. And so I think that the media is a horrible way to have information about this country. And I think that a lot of Europeans especially formulate opinions about Israel just through what they read through the media or just what they learn in university instead of actually coming here and experiencing it. And I think that's very ignorant.
I think the international media, they're a wider battlefield for this conflict, in which, ironically, Israel is the underdog due to Palestine being the actual underdog. International media shapes a lot of how people view what's happening here. And a lot of times it doesn't have that much to do with the actual reality.
But did growing up in Israel shape the identity of our interviewees? And how do they experience being left-winged in Israel? Do they feel a kind of friction between their ideology and their loyalty to the country they grew up in?
When the country is at war, it's not considered legitimate to criticize the action in war. I think, again, in my circles, here in the hostel or with my friends from university, I can say whatever I want, but even at home with my parents who are quite educated and quite left-wing, saying that I think it's a waste of time and it's immoral to be bombing Gaza and that it's harmful both to us and to them is at a sensitive time during a war. It's not something you can say in the streets. People start wearing blue and white shirts with Israeli flags all over themselves and becoming so much more nationalistic than they are every day, which is already quite nationalistic. And yeah, criticizing the action and saying that you think Palestinian lives matter and that you think maybe we should be trying to speak to Hamas is something that Israelis are just like, what? You're so deluded. Why do you think there's any reason to speak to them? Sometimes I think I am nobody outside of this place. Like, it's so central to who I am that, like, on the one hand, I don't want people to ask me about it when I'm traveling, but on the other hand, I don't really know what else to say about the place I come from. And I've always lived here. I've always lived in Jerusalem, which is like the pillar, the center of this whole thing. So it's such a deep part of who I am that, like, I really feel like I need to leave for a while and live somewhere else and experience myself as a person who's not stressed and angry and judgmental of everything I see, of the Orthodox, of right-wing settlers, of extremist Palestinians. Just everything is so intense, and I don't know if I take away all those layers what I'll find underneath. Probably just someone who likes literature.
Well, it's clearly a story of people who become come to a certain age where they start thinking of, on their own feet.
Jolle Demmers is an associate professor and co-founder of the Centre for Conflict Studies at Utrecht University. She has written on theories of violent conflict and social identity and is also interested in the meaning of space and how space can be contested.
And start to show sort of agency in the sense that they want to determine who they are and where they stand politically. And they see clearly, because they're pretty well educated and clever people, that they're being told a certain story that they don't, a story that they can't support, or a story that they're being told that is now used for political reasons. I think that's mostly what they see happening, and for reasons that they don't support by people and politicians that they don't support.
I think I came to this country very naive, that this conflict could be solved if people just understood each other. In a way I still believe that. I think that people should talk to each other, and how it shapes my identity though, the conflict, to be honest, it's making me, I think, understand more and more of what I believe in and who I am. Like, growing up in the US and in Central America, I was never faced with the same questions that I've been faced with in this country. And I think that this, the identity that's formed when you're living in Israel, it makes you very aware of what you believe in.
I do think it's part of what made me really try to be aware of the foreign other, the very, very different other. The one that's not just different from me, but on the opposite side of the fence from me. Which was a struggle growing up. But I like the place it left me.
I grew up in Jerusalem during the Second Intifada, and for years I was afraid of Arabs. If I heard somebody speaking Arabic next to me, it made me really uncomfortable. And even when I was visiting family in the States, if I saw someone wearing a hijab, I felt scared, even if it's a woman with a child and there's no reason. And I think it's important, like any trauma, on an individual level or a national level, to work through it and ask yourself what the result of it is and why you feel that way, because with time you can overcome it. And I'm not afraid of Arabs anymore, and I work with them and they speak Arabic next to me all the time, and I don't feel as uncomfortable as I used to, but you need to have an awareness. I think at first when I was developing this extremely left-wing identity, which started sort of in my first year at university, I felt like there was friction between being left-wing and being Israeli and Zionist. But it's been a few years now, and I've had a lot of time to think, and a lot of things have happened, and I actually feel like, it might sound really condescending to a lot of Israelis, but I feel like it's my moral obligation as a Zionist and as an Israeli to stand here and scream, look where we're going, this is horrible. And I don't feel a friction anymore. I feel like this is my identity as an Israeli.
Our interviewees were raised during the Second Intifada, which lasted from September 2000 until September 2005. As a result of the Second Intifada, a wall was constructed between Israel and the West Bank. The wall is 620 kilometers long and 8 meters high. We've asked our interviewees about the changes since the construction of the wall, and if they feel safe in their country.
So you feel the government is watching you constantly. Obviously I think it's much worse for the Palestinians or Arabs than it is for the Jews. I think there is a level of, I don't really know what to call it. They call it security, but I think in a way it's reminding Palestinians where they are in society. I remember coming from Jordan into Israel in a checkpoint where Israelis are not allowed. It's only Palestinians and foreigners that can go through this checkpoint. I have never seen so much racism in this country until I was in this one place where the people that work there clearly hate Arabs, and they love to humiliate them. They love to make them feel like they're animals. And I watched this happening, and as soon as people see the American passport, or even, well, then I was able to show my Israeli passport that I was coming back in, it was if oh, of course, welcome home, everything's fine, don't worry. And like 10 minutes before that, I had seen an innocent Palestinian mother trying to go through with her kid. She had no bags on her, and they're treating her like she has to go through security 10 more times. It's just like this, just reminding them, look who's in charge, you're a security threat, this kind of thing.
I'm Israeli, I can go anywhere. I mean, yeah, I have a blue ID. Even if I go to Palestine where it's like I'm not allowed, they check me at the checkpoint going out. No one's going to do anything to me. No one's going to take me to those checkpoints. No one asked me anything. I took him through an Israeli-only checkpoint once because just no one would talk to me. It's very different. Israelis don't have a lot of restrictions. We can't go to Ramallah as much or like inside Palestine, but if we try, it's a lot easier for us. It's not as easy for them. And no one's going to stop us in Ramallah and be like, where are you from? What are you doing here? Give me your ID. Or if they would to him.
It was a different time, it was a different reality. I remember tearful arguments with my parents about me wanting to go out to the city and them saying that the police has issued a warning, and eventually me staying home, and then the suicide bombing happening in the downtown area. And I think this is something that happened to every Israeli. The bus that I would take every day to school exploded. There's been enough bombings for all of us to have like a routine bus explode. And I remember that. I remember going on the bus and looking at every person who got on. I remember, obsessively checking every bag that you saw anywhere, asking people around, is it yours, is it his? I remember getting scared when someone got on the bus with a coat while it didn't seem that cold. A lot of this changed from the 90s. A lot of this was affected by the building of the wall. And it's no longer like that. Nowadays I feel safe because there's not as much danger on a practical level.
The wall is completely cut off any kind of communication. So I think that now, especially with the situation in Israel, I think a lot of people want to be progressive and they want to talk to each other, but now they just can't. Israelis can't cross that point. Like, they can't go over there, and for Palestinians that want to cross the wall, it's also very difficult. Some of them can, but it's difficult. I think the wall obviously probably brought on some security measures for Israel, but I think it also took a lot of good things away. With the bad that it removed, it took a lot of good things away. People don't talk to each other. They don't know each other.
The construction of the wall seems to have cut off communication between the Israeli and Palestinians. However, although communication through the wall is nearly impossible, we've seen that people have sought for ways of communication via the wall through street art and graffiti. Also, when we visited Israeli cities, we discovered that their streets are filled with graffiti and street art. Quite a lot of this graffiti carries a political message. We've asked our interviewees about their views of the potential of street art as a medium to express political critique and a way of communicating with the other.
I'm a huge fan of making statements through art in general. I think it's a beautiful way to create something instead of destroy something, which is so much more often the path people choose.
Yeah, that is exactly what artists do in terms of, in a highly theoretical way, they sort of reimagine the state and they show it's an imagination because they show that you can also reimagine it and think it differently.
The thing is that it was clearly covered up what was written there before. Like, if you look at the graffiti, if I remember correctly, it said all of the politicians that were kind of fighting each other during the elections, and it was put there right before the elections. And then someone painted over the fact, like, what can save this country, and it was something that was supposed to be much more tolerant, and now it says just Mashiach, which means the Messiah. And this is interesting how one group's graffiti has now been used for another group. Like, they took it over and were like, no, we're going to show them that, like, the Messiah is the only one that can save this country. this is something I think it's actually more interesting about the graffiti in Jerusalem, because sometimes it ends up being like this layered fight over one person's point of view, then covered up by another person's point of view, then, you know, people add on to it. Well, first of all, I think street art gets across to more people than just someone posting things on Facebook, for example. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously on street art, especially if it's on a main street, like on Yafo, where that piece is, that's a huge piece of wall, like, you know, hundreds of people are walking down Jaffa every single day and they see that. This is something that I think street art has that ability, is by making people aware. Listen, in Jerusalem is a place of bubbles. There are kids that live on the opposite side of the market from me, and they grew up in a completely ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, and they, you know, they're not really exposed to women being anything other than ultra-Orthodox women until they leave their neighborhood. So for especially these kind of groups, I think this is what street art does. It makes them aware that, like, oh wow, our bubble is not the only thing that exists. There's something that exists outside of us. I think this is why graffiti in one way is kind of a protective way of maybe saying something, because then you avoid conflict in a way, and still people see that you have that point of view.
Yeah, because that's sort of the opposite. If you want to contest the state or critique the state through spatial means, so through street art, then you actually have to go out there and paint a wall or do something physical. And of course we know that you can get caught and your paintings can be painted over again. So you'll end up in this you engage in a certain conflict with the state directly, which you also run certain risks, which is a sort of a physical exchange. Another strategy that you see a lot, of course, in the contemporary world is how people try to sort of move around that interaction by entering digital space as a form of protest and as a way to make their voices heard. A lot is allowed online, a lot of criticism, and sometimes also a certain level of mobilization is allowed online, but it's very highly surveyed and it's very highly monitored by the Israeli state. My hypothesis is actually that the Israeli state is very happy having a lot of these young kids sitting behind computers now in internet cafes voicing their anger instead of having them on the streets throwing stones.
Well, I express it also in the real world, but I think the virtual environment, I love Facebook because I think it has the advantage of being a bigger platform than you usually have. All the people I know, more or less, are there. So if there's something that you feel you want to say to a bigger audience, it's a useful tool.
The biggest advantage it has in terms of expressing what it wants to say and kind of reaching a wide variety of people is it's online, and there are no borders. You can organize face-to-face meetings with Palestinians. It's a lot harder to organize face-to-face meetings with Lebanese, Syrians, Moroccans, Tunisians, Sudanese, Jordanians, whatever. With online programs and with an online movement, we have people from all over the world that are all kind of both receiving the same message, putting out the same message, participating in programs together, and it's something that's not available on any other platform other than online. And that's the real power of Yao, the fact that it has over 750 members, and they're all, they're not all active, but they're all seeing what we're doing. They all are saying, we want to change, we want to be the voice of the next generation, and we're all united in this cause, even though there are physical barriers that we can't cross.
Our interviewees were asked to consider a solution to the conflict. They've told us about what they consider realistic solutions, as well as the most ideal solutions. How would they like to see their region?
That's the beauty of the human needs approach, that sort of it's peeling off all the layers of discourses and positions people take in a conflict, and then ask the question, but what do you really need to live a good life? And then you see that most people say, well, I want to just have a secure environment with no violence. I want to be able to send my kids to a proper school. I want to find employment.
There were people here who were prophesizing how things were going to look, way before my time, and I want to be part of that legacy, of the people who stand up and say, like, let's save this before there's nothing left to save, because I love this country and because I feel it's important, and I want to raise my children here and I want to be close to my family and always be part of what's happening here. But if it continues to become violent and racist and divided and, God forbid, an apartheid state 30 years from now, I won't stay, and I want to fix it before it's too late.
Any solution needs to include the other side, and not just the other side, the Palestinians, but the other side, the right wing. Any solution you make needs to include these 50-something% which voted that way, and you can't behave like we're right and we need to get rid of these people.
We need religion, we need signifiers, we need frames in order to understand ourselves and to understand other people, and we become happy by that. But sometimes we also feel in the construction of ourselves that we are contested by the other. And that is normally not based on the other who knows us or us who know the other. It is normally based on what we hear about the other, how we construct this otherness in our own image of ourselves. So my ideal world would be a world in which we are not without borders or without religion, but a world in which we recognize the other in ourselves and ourselves in the other, whether it's a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian or a Palestinian or whatever.
Hopefully, in the near future, and I say hopefully because a lot of people don't have hope, including unfortunately me, hopefully it'll get better. Hopefully there will be a two-country solution, and as I said before, we'll be able to travel freely between the two, and I'll be able to visit him at his home without, having to take 1 million buses.
Play out here. I think Israelis and Palestinians have much more in common culturally than they like to think. I've gotten to know more Palestinians through my job here. There is such a culture of hospitality on both sides of the border, and great food on both sides, and just human warmth. It's Mediterranean and Middle Eastern, and it's the way of desert people or whatever. So I think it could be, I think the Middle East 100 years from now might be the most incredible region of the world. I wish I could, if things were perfect, I would be able to drive to Lebanon on the weekend and spend a few nights in Beirut, or go on a road trip to Iran, because I think of it a little bit from a perspective of a backpacker, how hard it is to come into this area and to go from here to Jordan and then come back. And if you've gone to Israel, you can never go to Lebanon, or you have to wait for 10 years to get a new passport because you'll get given a really hard time. So I think, in an ideal situation, we would just be humans interacting with each other's cultures and comparing the hummus in Beirut to the hummus in Jerusalem. And just, there would be no walls, and I could drive to Ramallah and not be afraid of Palestinians.
There's a lot of stuff generally in modern society, but specifically in my own society, which I struggle with. I don't agree with it, and sometimes I really find it repulsive, and not all of it has to do with specifics within Israeli culture. I think there's some things that affect our culture in very subtle ways. For example, I really think the army leads us towards a more aggressive, more macho state of mind. On the other hand, this is home. Growing up here, it's really hard to view myself as part of somewhere else. It's really part of somewhere else. I've traveled long and far. I've been to places which I loved and met a lot of people which I loved, but I've never felt at home really outside of Jerusalem. And I guess that ties into that.